All right, I will now turn off my camera, and as I mentioned before, Emma, you will see a message from me in the chat that says you can begin. But yeah, it will probably take about 2 or 3 minutes until you get that message. So yeah, enjoy the event and talk to you later.
Great, thank you. Hey, hello and welcome everyone. We're ready to kick things off. Welcome to this LSE Festival online session, How to Manage Transition in Turbulent Times, part of our Skills for a Fast Changing World series hosted by LSE Online. In this series, we invite LSE experts to discuss research trends in their field about professional skills we need for success. My name is Emma. I am the head of the LSE Online team. LSE Online makes LSE's world-leading teaching and research accessible to a global audience. We provide a comprehensive portfolio of online programs to equip you and your organisation with the knowledge and skills to advance in an ever-changing world. Today's event forms part of the LSE Festival People and Change, which has been taking place all week. We've had some great events, so hopefully some of you have been able to join them. And this will end tomorrow, Saturday, the 17th of June. The festival this year explores how change affects people and how people affect change. The event is being recorded and we will hopefully be making this available as a video or podcast afterwards, subject to us having no technical difficulties. While we wait for everyone to arrive, we'd love to hear where you are joining us from in the world. So if you can just drop that in the chat, that would be really interesting. Today we are welcoming Dr. Katarina Glyniadaki for our last LSE Festival online skills session. Katarina is a teaching fellow at the School of Public Policy at LSE, as well as a tutor for our online course Risk and Crisis Management. She holds a PhD in European Studies from the European Institute of LSE. If you have any questions during the event you'd like to ask Katarina, please do post them into the Q&A box, and we will try to get through as many as we can towards the end of the event. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand over to Katarina. Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for different parts of the world, as it seems. I would start by sharing my slides. Everything looks okay now? Let me make it full screen. Okay, here we go. So as Emma mentioned, I'll be discussing today how to handle change in turbulent times. I will focus on changes that individuals and organizations undergo while also being in a broader environment of instability and perhaps of crisis as well. And I will try to both mention and discuss things and ideas to think about, but also kind of bring in bits and pieces of practical advice. For this talk, I'll be drawing from the online course, LSE course on risk and crisis management. I will need to say here that the conveners of this course is Professor Martin Lodge and Dr. Andrea Manikin. So some of the ideas I'll discuss today are their ideas as well. And I also draw examples from my own research in migration management in different countries, primarily Germany, but also Greece, and most recently Senegal as well. So let me start by defining the key terms here. What do we mean by transition? There are obviously different ways and different meanings of such umbrella words, but for this discussion today, I will focus on changes, whether these are changes we have chosen or they have come without our choice. Think changes that we like or we don't necessarily like, or changes that we expected or they came without our will necessarily. And by turbulent times, I mean the broader environment that could be unstable, it could be uncertain, and it could also affect both organizations, but also individuals in different ways. There are 4 aspects I would like to cover today. These are anticipation, sense-making, response, and learning. And I will explain each of them. So in terms of anticipation, I would start here by mentioning a quote we have all heard, and it sounds a bit like a truism, but it's important to remember as a starting point especially, which is that the only constant in life is change. And it's true that human societies have come where they are today because they have evolved over the years, and change has been an integral part of humanity for hundreds and thousands and millions of years. So it is like it will continue to be so, and it's likely to remain the case in the years to come. So with that in mind, it'd be really helpful to have awareness of events or things that are changing around the world that may or may not affect us today directly, but they might will in the near future. So there are different categories of changes that I would like to talk about now. And one of them could be what I call here ambiguous changes. So there are events like the AI advancement that it's been discussed a lot these days. And we don't know what this new thing will bring to us. It could be positive changes that down the line, it could be a negative or the scary changes in the future, or it could be both. And that remains to be seen, and that's something we need to be aware of as time passes. There are also other categories of changes, what we call hazards in the course. An example of this would be the conflict in Sudan. It seems now as a conflict within the country, but it could have implications in different regions and in different populations. So there has already been a displacement of 1.2 million people. There are dangers for broader instability in the region. Neighboring Chad is already a country to watch for. And that's something to keep in mind, because changes will definitely be negative. The question is how big they will be and how soon they will come about. And there's also the category of creeping crisis. And a classic example of this would be climate change, where things are changing very slowly, and we don't necessarily notice as things are changing, and we don't necessarily think that these changes are affecting us today. And some parts of the world might be affected more than others, but in time, all of us are likely to be affected, and in very serious ways as well. So it's important to have a broader awareness of what is happening in the world, and an alertness, I would say, as well. But it's also important to be self-aware and to see where we stand and to have a clarity in terms of our own opinions and values and identities on key issues, especially when there are issues that are politicized and highly controversial, like migration. Because when we do have an understanding, if and when a time comes when we come across unprecedented circumstances and we have to make ad hoc decisions, these decisions will be informed decisions. And this is what we want to maximize to the extent that it's possible. And I would like to bring here an example of climate change in the Sahel region in Africa. So the picture at the top right is a picture from last August in Dakar, the capital of Senegal. I worked and lived there for over a year, and I was there throughout the rain season last year. I can tell you from personal experience, it was a difficult experience. People's lives were affected. It was really difficult to go from point A to point B. It was impossible to take a taxi. And I was lucky enough to live on the 4th floor and to at least have some safety inside my own flat, but that was not the case for a lot of people. There was a lot of internal displacement, and things were quite difficult overall. And of course, there's a lack of infrastructure there and other reasons as well, but there's the locals were talking about the situation getting worse and worse every year. And that's only one aspect of climate change, because actually most of the months during the year, the climate is very dry and very, very hot. And different countries and regions within Sahel are affected differently by this. But there has been already acknowledged that these weather changes are causing people to have to move. There's a scarcity of resources, a scarcity of water, and that also causes conflict and political instability, or it exacerbates the existing situation in some occasions. And while there is ongoing displacement, we don't know how this will affect future migration flows. And I wouldn't be surprised if we had more climate refugees and asylum seekers in Europe and the UK in the years to come. So that's an example of a situation that seems very far, and both geographically and in terms of time from where we are today, but it's actually not that far as one might think. The second aspect I would like to discuss now is the idea of sense making. And by that, I mean here, taking in new information, processing it, organizing the ideas in our heads, and understanding it. And that's the case especially when a new event happens that for us is unprecedented, and it's really important to have the tools conceptually to manage this event. And the first concept that we also discussed in the course is the idea of healthy skepticism. And what I would like to mention first is being able to distinguish between opinions and facts, and to also face the facts and face reality, accept reality as it is. I mean, we've seen in recent years with the Brexit or the pandemic or the election of populist politicians in different parts of the world, in cases, especially, for example, with the pandemic, when politicians refused to accept reality early on, they didn't really manage to handle and eliminate the effects and the negative consequences of the pandemic so well. So it's important to understand what are facts and what aren't, and to accept the facts. But it's also important to understand that we can never have full information about something. As humans, we will also have biases and we'll have blind spots. That means there will be a lot of things that we don't know, but also a lot of things that we don't know. So as mentioned in the literature, we operate under bounded rationality. So knowing that we have these disadvantages and weaknesses as humans, we should still try our best to make sense of every new event or crisis that may occur. And the next step in this process, I would say, is to take different perspectives. And of course, part of it is to be open to listen and to take in new information, even if this information doesn't necessarily agree with what we already believe and think about. but it's also important to try to engage with opposing perspectives and narratives that are either different or completely opposite from what we already think, and to question our own. And by just revisiting our own perspectives, then we can have more informed decisions, but also more well-rounded understanding of what's happening. And the underlying message here is to embrace complexity and to keep in mind that things are never black or white or right or wrong. It's important in this process also to ask the right questions. So when something new has occurred, it's important to ask, what is it? Who or what has caused it? Who is being mostly affected by it? What were some strategies that were used in the past that we can bring in this case, to better handle it this time? And I'll mention here now a couple of research insights from my PhD research, which I finished 3 years ago. So for my PhD, I focused on Athens and Berlin during the so-called refugee crisis period of 2015, 2017. And the question I was trying to answer is, how do those at the front lines of migration management make decisions under conditions of high uncertainty? And to do that, I conducted about 150 interviews with the frontline workers and different actors in the field who were delivering services to asylum seekers and refugees. This could be legal assistance, care work, asylum services. And there were a lot of conclusions to be drawn there. One of the things I emphasized was the importance of identities when it comes to making decisions under conditions of high uncertainty. And one particular example I'd like to use here that relates to sense making is, how do we engage with the other? So by speaking to the people on the ground, one thorny issue that came to surface was that even though the people who were willing and had chosen to help asylum seekers and refugees at the time were generally very open-minded and liberal people in terms of values, a lot of the people they were helping, they came from parts of the world where they had more traditional and conservative understandings of gender and gender roles and other values in general. So this created kind of a gap between them in terms of communication, and also some practical issues about, for example, whether girls should be doing sports or not. And this created difficulties, and different frontline actors at the time responded in different ways. And what I found was the most effective and efficient way to tackle this difference was when it was conceptualized as something changeable. So they would say things like, oh, here in Germany too, or here in Greece too, a few decades ago, people were thinking more traditionally and more conservatively compared to today. So traditional gender roles were more prevalent back then. Now they've changed. So these people are here today. Maybe they will also change in a few years. It doesn't matter that now we think differently. So the key message of this example is that we need to embrace change, and sometimes embracing change could be a vehicle for connection and for also succeeding in whatever task we find challenging. The third aspect here that I would like to talk about is response. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that every situation is different and there is no one size fits all. Every context calls for different responses, and every person and organization is affected differently by different events. But I will still try to bring up a couple of general principles that could be applicable across contexts. And the first one here is the idea of pragmatism. And by that, I mean to be able to take practical steps to solve problems, even though we might face difficulties such as lack of resources, lack of information, time pressure, increased workload. An example I can bring on this one is from asylum officers making asylum decisions in Athens at the time, where they were operating under particularly challenging conditions. They were lacking in terms of infrastructure. Their offices were in prefabricated buildings. They were a lot of new hires because there was an unprecedented amount of asylum claims at the time, and which means that they did not have experience and know-how yet on how to handle the situation. And also there were new flows of asylum seekers from countries that we didn't necessarily have before. So there was no existing knowledge. And the way they responded in that occasion was by using innovation and collaboration. So they created new databases with asylum decisions and explanations for each case. They worked together, they shared information with each other, and they also explored new legal pathways for meeting the needs of those asylum seekers that were not necessarily, that were kind of falling through the cracks at the time. So that's an example of kind of using practical and pragmatic solutions to kind of getting the job done. And then a similar good example I could bring from Berlin for the second principle I'd like to discuss, which is behavior adjustment and the idea that we need to change what we've always been doing when the situation calls for it. So at the time in Berlin, there were kind of distinct lines between different sectors. So it was the public sector, there was some contracting, so there were some services delivered by the private sector, and there were a lot of NGOs belonging, let's say, to the third sector. And there was not necessarily much collaboration between these different sectors. But as the need for new services outweighed the supply quite a lot, these actors had to manage find new ways to manage the new problem. So one of the things they did is forge bridges between different sectors, and there was the collaboration between them became a lot more intense. There was a network created, or what I've called a community of practice at the time, and this was really, really helpful and efficient in enriching beneficiaries and, again, getting the job done. And lastly, the third principle I'd like to discuss here is the idea of resilience. I have met in different parts of my life a lot of successful people, and usually none of these people have become successful because they found things easy throughout their lives. There are people who have failed, they failed again and again. They felt better every time, and eventually they managed to succeed in whatever they're doing. So having resilience and keep going when the going is tough is important. And I'll bring here an example of a recent study we're running with my colleagues on Senegal, or migrant returnees in West Africa, and particularly in Senegal. So these are people who have attempted to migrate, usually irregularly, to Europe. A lot of them have managed to cross the sea. Some of them have not gone beyond Africa. They've just traveled within different parts of Africa. They had very traumatic journeys in the way. And some of them have chosen to return because things were not going as they were hoping in terms of doing well professionally and gaining money to help their families back home. Or they have been deported in some cases. And in either case, going back to their own home communities, it's very challenging. It's considered stigmatizing. People have high expectations, and people who return empty-handed kind of fail to meet these expectations. So it's not an easy situation, but we did come across individuals who had returned. Not only had they managed to overcome the stigma of empty-handedness and the difficulty of having experienced a traumatic journey many times, but also they managed to become community leaders and to influence people in positive ways, to influence their community, to be the people to whom people look up to and ask advice. And there are different angles to look at this. Sometimes there's more nuance because these people work for international organizations that are internationally funded. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to highlight the importance of resilience and the importance of continuing to persist even things are not going well. And the fourth and final aspect I'd like to bring here is the importance of learning. This means to ask what has happened, or maybe what has not happened, and why that's the case, and to understand and to draw conclusions that would be helpful in the future. And here's another cliche that I think it's really helpful in this occasion, is the idea of learning from our mistakes and not repeating them. And what I would also like to add is even better to learn from the mistakes of others and not repeating them. So going back to the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, 2017 in Europe, even though I previously mentioned a couple of shining examples of situations that were well handled, there were also a lot of situations that were very poorly handled, but both at the local level and at the national level and at the EU level. And there were people who became even more vulnerable after reaching Europe. There are people who took months and months until they managed to get access to claim asylum. The people who lived in terrible conditions for a long time. There were a lot of problems and a lot of lessons to be learned from that experience. Even, of course, the very fact that they were now, after several years of being at the front lines, there were a lot of individuals and organizations who were there. They just, by doing that, they have gained some experience and some know-how, especially for countries that were not traditionally considered host migration countries, such as Greece. There has also been time since then to build capacity, both in terms of material resources, but also in terms of human resources. There's an opportunity to build further local international collaboration. And at the individual level, and having all of the above in mind, people could be more ready and more flexible and have put together a tool set and the skills to respond better at the next similar situation. Again, we don't know the extent to which these lessons have been learned. But for example, with the recent wave of refugees from Ukraine, it seems so far that there has been a faster response, a bit more coordinated response from the EU. And people were processed faster and were able to work towards integration at sooner than the previous waves in 2015-17 did. And of course, I understand that has to do with other factors as well, such as EU-Russia relations. But it does, for now, even though it remains to be seen, it gives a glimpse of hope that some lessons at least have been learned. But always the question is, when an event or a crisis has occurred, and especially when it has finished, is to think about what we can learn, because this is exactly what will prepare us for the next possible event, but also increase our awareness which is the first step I was talking about. So just last week, I was browsing the websites of different international organizations. And for instance, the World Bank, one of the titles you can see there is that there's a risk for global recession in 2023, which is rising. The World Health Organization is talking about a multi-country outbreak of monkeypox. And the UNHCR is highlighting the South Sudan refugee crisis. And the reason I'm mentioning these examples is to say that there will be more turbulent times ahead. And these are global events that we might think they're affecting us or not affecting us enough in the near future. But these are things to keep in mind and to be alert about, because they could affect us more than we think. So just to recap, I talked about 4 main aspects of managing transition in turbulent times. The first one was anticipation. So becoming aware of what's happening globally, but also where we stand in relation to key issues. and having expectations accordingly, and being ready and flexible conceptually to respond to this. The second aspect I talked about was the idea of sense making. And I talked about healthy skepticism and the importance of distinguishing facts from opinions, the importance of accepting reality, but also the importance of remaining open and taking the perspective of the other, of the opposite narrative, whatever that is, and overall embracing complexity and the idea that there's always good and bad in either side. Next, I talked about response strategies, the importance of finding pragmatic solutions under limited information or even lack of policy specific protocols or lack of resources. Being able to adjust our behavior and change ourselves within the situation is also key here, but also remaining resilient when things are not going well. Finally, I cannot stretch enough the importance of learning from crisis, the importance of reflecting of what has happened and why, evaluating the situation, learning from our mistakes, and be ready for what comes next, because they most likely will be more turbulent times ahead. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to your questions and continue our discussion together.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Katerina. That was really interesting. Lots of takeaways from that, not just kind of in relation to migration, but also just general decision making in times of change, which, you know, I can really relate to from a management and decision making perspective. So hopefully everyone really enjoyed that. Katerina, Holly has just asked if we wanted to find out more about the topics you've spoken on today, where would you advise that we go?
Well, like I said, I drew for two main sources of information. The one is my own research, which you can find, I guess, my thesis on LSE library. I have 3 articles already published, if you could perhaps Google my name, but also a lot of the key principles are things we discussed in the LSE online course on risk and crisis management. So I would welcome you to take this course and join us at the next time it's being offered.
Great, thank you. Do keep your questions coming into the Q&A chat there. We have another one from Vivos. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. I'm wondering what you think can encourage resilience, especially in situations like the ones you described of migrants who overcome stigma, but also in broader terms when it comes to situations of crisis.
I want to make sure I understand the question correctly. Is the question about where we draw from resilience to make sure we build resilience?
Yes, I think
yes.
Encouraging resilience, yeah.
That's a very good question and a very difficult question to answer, and because it's very individual, I'd say, and it's not easy. I think the main thing that comes to my mind is to be very resourceful and to have hope. So the people so for the purposes of our research of the project I mentioned, we have talked both to people who returned and become community leaders and people who returned and have not engaged in similar roles. And of course, it's a matter of opportunity as well. Some people did not come across this opportunity, but there were the people who did take on these roles generally had a more positive outlook and we're hoping that things will turn out well in the end. Again, this is not panacea because it is really a matter of luck as well a lot of the times because this opportunity came their way. Oftentimes, it's just a matter of building resilience over time as well and going from event to event and having learned lessons and having this faith that in the end things will work out. I have to say here that these are quite general remarks and these are things I generally think about, but it really depends on the context and the specific situation.
Right. Okay, another question we have, looking at the recent tragic events in Greece with the migrants, in that situation, do you think the response to the events was drawing on learnings from past mistakes?
That is a very political question. I'm of course not going to defend the government in any way. It's a very tragic event. The priority is to save as many lives as possible, although it's not looking very hopeful at the time. At the moment, I cannot say that this definitely doesn't show that lessons have been learned.
Right. Carlos has asked, what can we do with so much political instability? What in reality is a world flooded with fake news? I think that's meant to be. Apologies.
Yeah, that's a discussion I actually had a lot with my students in the past term. And I meant to mention this during my talk and I forgot, so thank you. It's the importance of, the important role of social media is something I didn't mention, especially in the spread of fake news. I understand that as technology advances, it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish reality from fake news, but also it makes the need all more significant. And I'm kind of optimistic in terms of the younger generations being more tech savvy and being able to distinguish between what is real and what isn't. And perhaps that's something we should also have in the school curriculum in the coming years. But I think we all can agree that this is a need that it's becoming more and more obvious as time passes.
Thank you. Okay, I have another one just in. You seem to have looked into the outcome level of migration, but not the root causes. The permanent solution can only be found if we understand and address root causes. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I only look at outcome, because I did mention in the very beginning the issue of anticipation and the situation in the Sahel region, for instance. So that's definitely one of the root causes. There are various root causes, of course. But for instance, in the example I used in terms of climate change, that is something that governments could do something about, to make it less severe or less, I don't know, to contain the impact, I guess, of climate crisis, of climate change. I'm aware there are different routes of people, routes of causes of migration. People move for different reasons. Extreme poverty, political instability, conflict are, of course, things we should be doing something about. And I cannot answer for world leaders, but I agree with you that it should be a priority to address the root causes of migration.
Absolutely, and I think it's worth pointing out, I'm sure there's lots more Katerina could say if she had a bit longer than 35 minutes. So yeah, okay, next question. We have another one. Are you aware of transition psychology perspectives on coping with trauma, loss and change? The inherent human capacity to adapt constructively to trauma and change. Can you say anything about this?
No, that sounds fascinating. I would love to learn more about this. I have some basic awareness of social psychology, but I don't know more on this particular topic. And yes, please feel free to contact me or send me an email to share more on this topic with me. I'd be very interested in learning as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think, is that all of the questions we've got for now? Do post your questions into the Q&A box if there's any more that we haven't yet addressed. I'll give you a few minutes. I'm sure there's lots.
Yeah, maybe I finished my talk a few minutes sooner than was initially planning. I was thinking I would have more time for discussion afterwards.
Yes, people normally like time to ask questions. It normally just gives people just take a few minutes to build up the courage to post their questions. You're getting a lot of compliments. Your presentation was crisp and clear.
That's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. I don't think anything else is coming through. Oh, one more. Can you speak some more about your next plans in terms of your research?
Okay, sure. So the project in Senegal is the most recent one. We were conducting field work until January this year. There were a lot of difficulties. It's quite more challenging to conduct field work in Africa compared to Europe. And of course, one of the reasons is the language differences. There are a lot of people who only speak local languages, so we needed the help of translators in some occasions. It's also practically a little more difficult to locate people when in places where there are no addresses, for example. So this is where we are still. We have some preliminary findings. You could probably find a blog on this topic that just came out yesterday at the European Institute's blog, Europe BP. And we're still in the process with my colleagues Nora Ratzman and Julia Stier in analyzing the data we have collected and seeing where we go from there. Well, I didn't talk about this during the event so much, but there are different nuances in the dynamic where a lot of times these migrant returnees work for organizations that are funded from the EU, and a lot of the times the message they're called to spread is that migration is dangerous, and there are a lot of details about to what extent this message is being spread and it's being accepted by the audience. So in the next few months, we're planning to look further into this and hopefully to write something and publish something later this year.
Great. And I suppose in making kind of direct comparisons to like previous research, it can take quite a long period of time, right, for another kind of crisis to come around and to be able to compare how a government has responded relative to the one before. I know your research was on Athens and Berlin, I think it was, but you know, we could be waiting a long time to make direct comparisons and see if those governments have learned particularly from their own mistakes. Katerina, what do you think we can do or should be doing to encourage governments to learn from their previous mistakes? I know often people have got a short memory, right? And we come out of a pandemic, and I'm sure by the time there's another one, I don't know that we can expect them to look back that far and learn from those mistakes. What do you think we can do there?
Okay, I'm going to start responding to this by saying that I'm someone who is particularly interested in the implementation level of policy. And that's because I know there are a lot of gaps in terms of policy and practice in different countries. And I was quite curious to understand why these gaps exist. And having focused so much and for so long on what actually happens on the ground and how policies are being implemented, how services are being delivered, what are the challenges that people on the ground face. Because one of the things that I observed and I thought was interesting in my research is that, especially in times of crisis when things are uncertain, governments don't like to take difficult decisions, and which means practically that the people on the ground are the ones who have a disproportional weight in their shoulders to carry these difficult decisions. And I think if there was a lesson to be learned there for governments, is to listen to the people on the ground, because they are in the front lines and they're the ones seeing and facing and handling the most difficult situations and events. And that's the case, of course, in the so-called refugee crisis, but it could also be the case with the handling of the pandemic. The government should listen more to the nurses and to the doctors, and there should be direct lines of communication, and these are the people who should be able to somehow influence policy more. That's what I would say. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Okay, a question specifically on migration, I think. Do you have any comments on how Europe, the US and the UK will be affected by the migrations resulting from the conflicts in the Middle East?
I don't have any comments on that. I mean, in principle, we know that these countries, these regions mentioned, are the ones that are host to a lot of asylum seekers and migrants. They're also the places where a lot of potential migrants from different parts of the world wish to go to. So the reason I cannot answer this directly is because Middle East is not one of my areas of expertise. So I don't know enough of the details and the smaller things happening. I understand the situation in Afghanistan is very vulnerable. Syria hasn't gotten much better, and Lebanon is very unstable, but I cannot say specifically the connections, but I will say that it is an area where people will probably continue to try to migrate in the next few years, and UK, the US, Europe would be regions where these people would be really willing and interested going towards. And of course, the issue of smuggling comes in picture there, because that's a very thorny issue that it's worth discussing in a different talk.
Yeah, we're coming at you with a wide range of questions today. Okay, next one. Somebody has asked, are there any techniques you would recommend on an individual level? I presume decision-making techniques, I'm guessing.
I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, I think we need some clarification on that one.
Yeah, the person who wrote this could follow it up and say specifically what they mean. I should probably say that some of the things I mentioned, apart from drawing from the class I mentioned and my own research, would also be from my own experience, having worked in different countries and different environments. So the recent years I've lived in the UK, in Greece, in Senegal. I previously lived in the US, and I've worked both in academia and in more bureaucratic positions, but also in the past I've worked in sports. So I have transitioned between a lot of different roles over the years. And some of this, I would say, the things I discussed today would be things that would also be life lessons throughout my own experiences too.
Absolutely.
There's a question, clarification there?
No, I don't think so.
Discussion maybe.
Definitely.
We have strong discussion, that's a good thing.
Yes, maybe you've answered the question already. Brilliant. Okay, so we are going to wrap things up there. Thank you so much to our speaker, Katerina, for a fascinating talk, which I hope everybody has enjoyed. And thank you very much to the audience for joining as well. There are still some very exciting events coming up tomorrow, the last day of the festival, so please do check those out at lse.ac.uk/festival. Holly is also sharing the link in the chat box, and you can find out more about our LSE online courses via the link on the slide and also in the chat box. Risk and crisis management, Katerina works on, but there are lots of others as well, so please do take a look. Thank you everyone, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.